Welcome back. I'm Theresa Bruno. I'm the host of the Soul Talks podcast, and I'm here today with Nathalie Himmelrich. She's a counselor and coach in grief and trauma. She's an author, a podcaster, and she has a mission in life to help us heal. She has come through immense trauma herself, and she has walked the path of grief. She knows exactly what those of us who are surviving our own tragedies have been through. And this is my third time to get to sit and talk with Nathalie. I was on her podcast not too long ago, and then we had a pre-interview before that. And I have to tell you, one of the reasons that it was so important to me to have her on this podcast is that I can't say that I've ever sat in the presence of someone who was so present with me. It is every time I come away from her, my whole hours afterwards are so influenced by how present her spirit was with me. So I hope that will be palpable to you today as you sit with us as we chat and talk about her work and her life. Good morning. How are you? Well, I guess it's afternoon in Switzerland.
Yes, indeed it is. Thank you so much for the time that you offer with me and also inviting me to your show. Thank you so much for the introduction.
Yeah, just delighted to have you. You know, we've talked about my story and we've talked a little bit about your story, but not enough because I still have questions and gaps, you know, and I'm like, well, how did this influence her and how did she come to this? And one of the things that's sort of been running in my mind as I think about all the things I hope we can share with our audiences today. When you were young, when you were, you know, a little girl growing up, what were your spiritual influences at that time?
Good question. I mean, I've never thought about it then at that time. I would say that I had a fairly sheltered life as a young child, growing up, as we just discussed, in Switzerland, which is fairly safe and doesn't offer some of the challenges that other people have in this world in terms of violence or war or famine. So from that point of view, I would say pretty sheltered. But spiritual influences, so if I look back, my family is sort of from two religious dominations in Switzerland. One is Catholic, one is Protestants, and even though my father was one Catholic and my mother Protestant, it was never really a strong thing that we had to do or that we went to church. However, we went to church when, for example, my mother liked the music at Christmas. So we would go, or we would go to the Catholic church, and I would see people get up and do these things that I wasn't used to. And I think I sort of went to church because that was not expected of me, but that's what we did. But it wasn't something that I thoroughly enjoyed or that I had a strong connection to. I think, so it wasn't something that I really thought about at that time. I just followed the footsteps of what the community did or what my parents sort of suggested, and I went along. However, it gave me an insight into those two camps, and they were both accepted. I think that's important because when my parents got married, it was a bit of a struggle, because some of my father's family weren't happy for him marrying a Protestant. I mean, to me now, this is completely a non-topic. So I've been living with that being okay, but it was also not a topic of being difficult. I only found out much later. So that was sort of the religious side. But the spiritual side, I think, only later came into play when I remember I was a teenager, and then my father would bring me books of the Kabbalah or of hypnosis, things like that. So he broadened my mind, and I remember I would ask him, "Well, do you believe in that?" And sort of still in that, and I said, "I see it as a possibility."
Well, what a
So
wise man, though, to bring a young girl. I mean, those are big conceptual books that he was bringing to you. You know, that's not the usual thing a parent gives a child to read.
And honestly, I would also not say that's a common thing for him to do. Like that was, I think, I don't actually know where he found those books. He didn't buy them. It was not his thing. Definitely not. I don't know where he's got those books from. And he brought them, and I don't even know if he read them. But I remembered clearly a hypnosis book, and I was fascinated by that. But so that was more in teenage years.
Yeah. So did you carry forward a sense of, okay, there's this kind of universal consciousness, or there's a divine being that is there for me to lean into? I mean, what became your spiritual path or your understanding of something greater?
I think that happened much later when I was a young adult, where I sort of, maybe from those early impressions or different options that I read about, was really open to different books. I remember that many people gave me books, or books came to me about different kind of spirituality or spiritual leaders, and I was just curious. And early on, I moved overseas. I went and lived in Singapore first, and it gave me enough distance from my family of origin to follow my own path. And also, I think, having, as I said, growing up in Switzerland, it was sort of the navel of the world, and I believed at the time it was sort of the center of everything. And moving across to Asia really gave me the experience of not being the primary culture, to a point where I remember being in a shop and I wasn't being served because I was not Chinese or not Asian. And I didn't realize until they were just continue talking. So it was a good experience from that point of view, but it also gave me access to all these different things that were out there. And I remember there, and already before, when I look back, I had certain influences in my life, people that would feed me with different kind of ideas. And so I think in Singapore specifically, I went to courses and different modalities that sort of broadened my understanding and my interest in different kind of things in mind, in neurolinguistic programming in the beginning, but it wasn't named as such. So just different areas, sort of that. And it set me up on a path that then led me to live in Sydney, Australia, and study psychology at the time. And I was really involved in all kinds of things that had to do with personal development, human development in general, the humanistic society, and all these things that just, I think, which was much more open to the cultures, especially in Australia, than it was, or it didn't come across to me here. So I think I would say I found a spiritual community when I was in Australia. At that time, I was like 30 plus at that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting. So you specialize in grief and trauma, and I don't know this. I just intuit this by your presence, by your kindness, by your compassion and empathy, that you carry forward all of that deep spiritual underpinning that you filled yourself up with into what you practice.
I think there was a long journey of different modality or different personal development, let's call it this, more so than spiritual. However, they brought me into a community of people that practice meditation as such. Or in Australia also, there were some of the friends that I had that followed a guru as per se, and I would see them and observe them, but to me it was never something that I sort of practiced as an ongoing thing. And I don't know why that is, but I think from early on I had a talent or a gift or whatever, however you would want to call it, that I was a good listener. And I remember that already when I was like 10, people would search me out, like friends in school, and would talk to me. Now, I didn't plan that, or I didn't practice that, but I noticed they would come and speak to me, also boys at that time, and I was not thinking about it, but it was sort of curious. Also, I remembered 15, 16, I had these friendships with people and they would search me out because I was apparently a good listener. But it was never something I practiced or I planned. Much later then, when I did my coaching certification, we looked at what is, for example, listening or presence, what is it made out of? And I think to a certain degree, when I look back, why was I a good listener? Because it was safer to listen than to speak and be vulnerable or to open up, from my family system, from the upbringing that I have. So it was a safe place to listen, but also that meant I was practicing it. And I'm a deeply interested or curious person in people's lives. And to some degree, curiosity was not always appreciated. But in my profession, that's what I'm good at, because I'm not listening just to the person's story or gossip or whatever because of curiosity, but because of deep interest. And I'm listening in between the lines. And I'm in that giving space, holding space, as it's called.
That is so beautiful.
Resonating with what the person is saying. And often I noticed I could sense what's going on within them. But I didn't actually know what it was until at some point someone said to me, "Oh, you're so annoying with your clear sentience." And I didn't even know what that meant. And I said,
You're so annoying, but
"What do you mean?" And she explained it to me, and I thought, isn't that what everyone's doing? Mm-hmm. It wasn't something I knew about or I did on purpose or practiced in any way. It was just something that happened. But I've learned in my life, I've learned to differentiate between this is mine and this is not mine, or potentially from someone else. I can never say for sure, because I'm not an absolute person. But then I just bring it into the conversation and I say, it seems like that's what's here.
I'm sure you're probably familiar with the work of Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese monk who introduced this term generous listening and then incorporated in his community in France. I want to say it's I could be wrong about this, but maybe it's every Friday. The entire community comes together and one-on-one, and I don't know how this kind of happens, but they have hours of just generously listening to others and being quiet themselves. And I've thought about that concept so many times. And if we really went through life, in America especially, I find we complete each other's sentences. We can't wait to get our part out fast enough. We have to tell how, oh, you said that, and that's how it relates to me. And, we talk so much and so fast, and I think often without listening. And so I think we miss so much of the person on the other side of us. Absolutely. What we can learn from them, the goodness that they are pouring back at us if we take the time to receive it. So I just validate, underscore, and honor the way you approach listening. Mm. I wanted to ask, when you were doing all of your studies in Australia and becoming a therapist, coach, were you initially drawn to the work of grief and trauma?
Grief, definitely. Trauma, I think I didn't know at that time, but grief for sure. And looking back over my life now with hindsight, I can see that there was I call it a love affair with grief. What I mean by that is I had many relationships which I wasn't the person dissolving the relationship. So I would grieve them thoroughly. I don't want to say extremely, because what is extreme grief, or but intensely. I was giving myself to the experience of that missing, and I did that because that's just what I did. It's not that I can say I liked it or I liked myself being sad. It's nothing like that. It's just something that I did naturally. And so but I would, however, say, looking back, I practiced that. I practiced being with grief and with being the one that was left, in the sense that it's not my decision to leave. And so from that practice, I was fascinated with what happens in a human person when they experience loss. And I can only see that retrospectively. Even when I look at my loss history, I can see how I reacted to the first death I can remember is the death of my guinea pig. Or then later the death of my grandmother, or my grandfather first, and then my grandmother, those that I was very close to. So I can see those things happening. And when I studied applied psychology, there's certain things that are obligatory and certain things that you can choose, right? And I chose grief and loss as one of my studies that I liked. And I was fascinated by it. And I think to some degree it was synchronistically like a preparation for what was to come, not by any chance. So for example, one of the works that I did was it's a practice, a Buddhist practice, which is called 1 Year to Live, by an author called Stephen Levine, who actually goes through imagining that if you knew that within a year you would die, and he has some practices each month that you do as a preparation for death. And I did that with my Buddhist psychotherapist at the time. There was various things that in relation to dying, also practiced or worked at a hospice at some point, voluntary work. I also worked as a wish granter with terminally ill children, granting wishes. So there were different things that I did now retrospectively that I said, okay, that was in relation to people in extreme situations, anticipatory loss, grief, loss that was imminent, but something at the threshold between life and death fascinated me.
Oh, that's big.
Yeah,
That's enormous. You know, there's so many places in there I'd love to talk about and talk about and talk about. But you know, obviously that begs to jump forward into one of the biggest pivots, I guess, that probably ever happened in your life. And I wonder if you would just start at the very beginning of your journey that ultimately became the journey of losing your daughter.
yes. So from an early age, I wanted to have children. I knew that, and I also knew when the time is right and the partner is right, then I want to have children, and that coincided to the point where I was already over 40, and although my then husband, or becoming husband later, at the time didn't want to have children, I came to a point where I said, actually, I need to tell him that I want to have a child. And he said, let me go and think about it. And within less than 24 hours, he came back and said, okay. And I was astonished to his change of heart. And he said, no, I think the reasons for not having children were through his past, which I'm not going to go into it, but he then said, okay, at this point, it's yes. And so we went on a journey because of my age and his age. We said, okay, let's check the chances of being able to be pregnant or becoming pregnant with our situation. And at the time, we checked that out, and it was possible to become pregnant naturally. But I also knew that I had some condition in my ovaries that required an operation before, if we were to conceive through IVF. And so we tried naturally and subsequently tried IVF. And the first time we tried IVF, we implanted one fertilized egg. And during the time until the first scan, there were multiple incidents where I jokingly said something about twins. Now, I don't have any recollection that this was annoying. I can't say that I knew it. It's not like that. But then when we went to the first ultrasound, I mean, first of all, it happened the first time. And when she gave me the notice of the hormone being at a stage where it confirmed pregnancy, she said, oh, you've got very, what's the level, H something level, can't remember the word now. And I said, well, what does that mean? And she said, oh, it's sometimes high for people who have twins. But this is also not something I had heard. And because in Australia, the common way to do IVF is that the fertilized egg gets implanted on day 5, because they can see how it progresses over those 5 days. And they implanted 1 egg, so it wasn't an expectation that there would be twins. Whereas in Switzerland, for example, IVF implants eggs, fertilized eggs on day 3, and they usually implant 2 because of better chance. So when we had the first ultrasound, I jokingly said to the doctor in charge, oh, okay, well, there is like the placenta, and that stick figure is probably the baby. And he said, no, you've got twins. And I'm like, I laughed and I said, oh, you're making a joke. Mm-hmm. And he sort of looked at me sternly and said, I wouldn't joke about matters like that. And I was a bit pulled back. And I mean, I couldn't stop myself from laughing because of the things that I said, because I thought that was such great news.
Next week on the Soul Talks, Nathalie opens up about her twin pregnancy, the devastating diagnosis, and the choices no parent ever wants to face. Join us for part 2.